Well, hi everybody, Father Alex here. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast. My guest this week on the Godcast is author and female rights activist Julie Bindel. I do hope you enjoy the podcast. If you do, then do check out my YouTube channel or perhaps subscribe or look online. There are literally hundreds of podcasts with people from all walks of life. But for now, I do very much hope you enjoy this interview with Julie Bindel. I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Julie Bindel. Julie, it's wonderful to get you on. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you, Alex? Nice to talk to you.
I'm good. I'm enjoying the weather, as I think many of us are.
Lovely.
It's just a matter of time before the hose pipe ban kicks in, isn't it?
How true.
Yeah, Julie, it's great. It's great to get you on. Let's start by having a bit of a trip down memory lane. What was life like for a young Julie Bindel? Have you got happy memories of your teenage life, for example?
Well, I'm from a very loving working class family in the northeast of England, and lots of hardship, lots of difficulties growing up as a girl within that environment, because it's like patriarchy on steroids. And I know that people say it's the same everywhere, patriarchy is patriarchy, but actually it's more pronounced, I think, when we talk about northeastern working class life, probably because life is harder and women bear the brunt of that. But also when I entered my teens and was being bullied at school and was clearly not interested in boys and coming out as a lesbian, that was very hard. Having said that, there were also good times, happy times, and I was very, very lucky as a child in many ways.
What about religion, Jill? I don't want this to be overtly religious podcast, but being a woman of a certain vintage, shall we say, was there much religion knocking around the family home, or was it a topic of discussion, or never?
Well, no. My mum, her heritage was Irish Catholic, and on my dad's side, we have Jewish heritage, and secular household, atheist household, probably. It would be more apt. And religion didn't play a part in our lives. There would be the odd funeral or wedding where you heard prayers and religion was present, but massively fast forwarding to about 10 years ago, I traveled to Colorado to go undercover as a journalist looking at gay conversion therapy practiced by fundamentalist Christians. And I assumed a persona, someone who'd been kicked out of the church when it was discovered she was a lesbian. And I had to have my Jamaican Christian friend round to teach me the Lord's Prayer and bits like that you would, of course, know. And I didn't know any of it. So it didn't play a part in my life, no.
Well, part of me wants to jump to what you just said, but I want to go back to what you said about the patriarchy in the environment where you were at. I live and work around too. Pretty challenging, or I think that's probably an understatement. Very challenging working class estates where there has been significant increases in matters of domestic violence, for example. Just take us back to your time as a young woman. How would you define that? Or could you give examples of that kind of patriarchy that you used to see?
Well, most of the men on the big council estate in which we grew up were manual labourers, worked extremely hard. This was, I was born in 1962, so throughout the 60s and 70s and the 1980s, by the time I left home in as a 16-year-old in 1978. And my dad was a steel worker and also a union representative. But he would come home injured, exhausted, filthy. The first few years of our life, we didn't have an inside bathroom. We had a bathtub outside in the yard with a pipe that was connected to the backyard and an outdoor toilet. And life was hard for men that were doing this kind of work. And Often they were ill-treated, um, I think humiliated, abused by bosses and management. And it was very easy to take it out on women and on kids. Now, my dad was a very good man and he didn't do that. And I think that's because he'd seen his father be violent to his mother, my grandparents. But many other women on the estate would have black eyes, wouldn't be given enough money to feed the kids by the man that came home with his wage packet, which had obviously physical money in it, would spend it in the pub. It was a hard drinking culture. And women had to know their place because if men were working in the way that they did in those heavy industrial workplaces, then there had to be some contrast. There had to be the tea on the table when they came in. The kids had to be the sole responsibility of the women. And even though most working class women, including my mum, also had jobs, they were normally in the betting shop, in the corner shop, maybe in an office. And that was life. And so girls were treated differently. They were given less freedom than boys. We were meant to behave in a certain way, carry the honor of the family. And boys, were cut quite a bit more slack. They were going to grow up to be part of the workforce. So that was really it. It sounds terribly archaic and old-fashioned now, but it was not that long ago.
Yeah, just listening to you talk, it reminded me of my own. I'm a little bit younger. I was born in '69. Those things were still going on as I grew up. My mum had a very what might be described as a menial job, and my dad was the and there was a family who I was friends with, and it was very much like when Dad got home, nobody could speak. We all had to be very quiet, and the meal. Can you remember the point in your life, Julie, that made you kind of switch on to, I don't know if activism is the right word, but kind of, a rebuttal of these kind of things which are, become wider about sexuality and everything else. Can you remember that?
I always thought things weren't fair. So, for example, there was a hard drinking culture. Men would come out of the steel mill or the mines and go and sink 10 pints without it even touching the sides in working men's clubs, and women weren't allowed in there. Women were allowed in the snug, which is the kind of lounge they used to call it, and men were all in the bar. And they weren't allowed to go to the bar. And if they had a drink, they weren't allowed to drink a pint for those that didn't want the brandy and baby sham, right? There was no wine drinking in those days in the Northeast. They would have to have a half pint glass that they poured the pint into. They weren't allowed to drink from a pint glass. Now, obviously, that wasn't legislated. The police weren't going to come along if they did. It was social stigma. And there were lots of things that were unfair. Realizing that I didn't want a boyfriend and yet being called a slag at school because I rejected the advances of these boys and, they insult you however you behave. And then being called a lesbian as an insult. I realized that the social stigma is carried by girls. And we were restricted in so many ways. Our freedom was restricted. We were told that it wasn't safe for us to go out at night when our brothers were out. And this was all because of what men did to us. And then I saw a series on TV called Shoulder to Shoulder, which was in, I think, the early 70s. I must have been about 12 when it was broadcast. And it was about the suffragettes. And I was fascinated because it was very accessible, this TV series. And I had no idea that women before in earlier times had to fight so that we could vote, so that my mum could vote. And the class disparity, I've always been very focused on issues to do with class prejudice and discrimination, and realizing that, yes, of course, excuse me, yes, of course, the vote was won, but the first time round, working class women were excluded. And that just fascinated me because there was lots of direct action. So these women were using their physical selves to chain themselves to railings and other forms of protest that really appealed to me because, of course, as I said, my dad was a union representative. Um, there were protests, in and around working class communities when there were accidents in the mine because there was no health and safety, and these men were seen as cannon fodder, where women had to protest discrimination in, for example, the Ford factories, all of those things. And then when I moved age 17 to Leeds to follow my then girlfriend, it just so happened to be the hub of the women's liberation movement and of feminist direct action. So it was a very easy transition for me to move from that mindset that I'd grown up with, that you can bring about social change, to fighting for the cause that had become very, very dear to my heart. And as a lesbian, seeing the discrimination and the threats of sexual violence and physical violence from men because you were, in their view, rejecting them in every way that mattered to them as a lesbian.
Yeah, I'll come back to that, but I'm interested in what you think about um, whether we've made progress or not. I will plug my book. It's there as my book, Our Daily Bread, August to the Altar, and in there I write very much about estate life, and I'm interested to know how much progress you think. I mean, in many ways, I love working on the estates, Julie. It is humorous, it's funny, it's resilient, it's community, it's all those things. But it's also bloody hard as well. And there's a lot of things that trouble me that come to my attention. Domestic violence, one of those, drug addiction, those kind of things. And and in my book, I argue that we've never really solved the issue of social injustice and poverty. And I'm wondering where you think we are now, whether we've made enough progress or we've still a long way to go.
Not only have we not made progress, but things have gone massively backwards, and we're in a way worse position. Working class people, or those that rely on welfare, are in a much worse position than they ever were. We have now an underclass, and we've had that for a long time, since the 1980s, thanks to the Thatcher government. And now, of course, we have a failing NHS, a failing school system. Our welfare state is on the ground. Uh, it's way worse. Of course, the drug abuse and lack of any resources to deal with drug abuse except for prison. Prisons are overwhelmingly warehouses for the most disenfranchised people who should not be behind bars, who do not need to be behind bars. Certainly some should. I'm definitely not a prison abolitionist, but I would release the vast majority of female prisoners and a lot of the male prisoners and think about other ways to address crime and disorder. I think, wow, we're in a much worse situation. I feel very depressed saying this, and I do think that that's why so many people are turning to belief systems that are either healthy and positive or the direct opposite of that, turning to more cult-like belief systems in order to give their lives some meaning and to give their lives some order.
Yeah. I've been heavily involved with the issue of ketamine over the last 6 months or so, Julie, and I never really knew of it, and it's become a huge thing. And I've been campaigning for the reclassification of ketamine from a Class B to a Class A for various reasons. But it does play into the narrative that people are turning to these things because something is not fitting right at the moment. And when I've raised it I've raised it at every level, social services, police, NHS. There seems to be gaps that just seem to be like black holes. I describe them as that, and seems to be quite clear how to fill them. How do you go about starting putting back together a society that seems to have appeared to have collapsed so heavily, such as in the context of poverty and cost of living.
We live in a very, very cruel, heartless world. And it's definitely, in so many ways, way worse for poorer people, for homeless people, than it was when I was growing up. We have, in some ways, we developed a stronger welfare state and safety nets for people that really needed it, particularly with legislation such as the Disability Discrimination Act and other forms of similar legislation. But now we are in a heartless, cruel, callous, neoliberal society that really cares nothing about its citizens. And I know that sounds very pessimistic, and I'm normally an optimistic person. You have to be when you're a feminist campaigning to end male violence because we don't think boy babies are born bad. We think that people can learn new ways and change their ways. So I'm very, very much rooted in the notion of change for the better and rehabilitation and not giving up on people. But I think that particularly the narrative coming out of the assisted dying bill is grotesque. It's staggeringly heartless in every way. It presents itself, those supporting assisted dying or assisted suicide, as I call it, present themselves as kind, as compassionate. And they are I mean, it is the argument that they're using. I'm not talking about the individuals, but the argument that they're using is the most unkind, callous, heartless that I've heard in decades.
Yeah, I tend to agree with what you said. I often refer to the time of COVID where we were kind of celebrating the NHS and we were rattling our pots and pans, and the minute it's over, that my wife is a nurse, that these people will then become castigated and vilified because they can't get an appointment, etc., etc. But I just want to go back, Julie, to what you'd said there about male violence, really, and one of the concerns I have is in the estate context in recent years. One of the great sadnesses for me, Julie, is myself and my colleague. We see a lot of young boys um, from a very young age, and we actually can see their destination of travel.
Yeah.
We can see that they are heading for a life of maybe removal from schools, and then what? I mean, we have a number of kids that we're working with that have been removed from the school, and there seems to be no plan B now, what for that child. And then we see young children entering into drug dealing, drug running, and we can see their route map, and it's incredibly sad when you see it and you get to know the people, and then you speak out and nothing seems to happen. So it is a huge concern, and it is boys mainly. It's boys that are falling out of school who are losing these social interactions, they're losing an education, they're losing just basic skills of what it is to be a good human being, and obviously, I'm a priest. I might argue that that is the way for that resuscitation or recovery is through the Christian faith, but I understand there are others, but it's incredibly messy, isn't it?
It is. And I do know some men that are doing work with young boys and young men addressing these issues, and they're doing it from a very pragmatic point of view. They're looking at social exclusion, lack of confidence, being railroaded into effectively becoming porn addicted, and going down a route from which it would be very difficult to get back from. Michael Conroy, who's in your neck of the woods, ish, he set up an organization called Men at Work, and he does lots of youth work, which is really important, and I think quite similar to the kind of work that you're speaking about. Either way, it's pastoral care, isn't it? Whichever way, whether
Yeah.
it's faith-based or not. Um, and and I do see that. I think what's happening with girls is the re-stigmatization of female bodies to the point of where we've seen, for example, in the so-called gender wars, the awful, awful indoctrination by many of these girls that want to escape their female body for all kinds of reasons that we understand as feminists and we understand as human beings, sexual abuse, trauma, that we used to understand when it was self-harm, such as cutting or anorexia. We would see that that was a mental illness. We would see that that was um, a serious social ill. These girls had probably experienced something that would make them want to leave their female bodies. Now we're celebrating it as, well, you must be trans, you must be a boy. And we're also seeing girls being pushed into wishing to escape their bodies because of the overt pornification of their bodies and their lives, where boys at school are accessing hardcore misogynistic porn on their smartphones from a very young age, which is, of course, shaping their brains, shaping their attitudes. You can't watch that kind of misogynistic propaganda and it not give you a view of girls and women as subhuman and therefore basically one-sided sexual pleasure. And so these girls are now a bit of a lost tribe, really. They are growing up with no confidence. They're reading Teen Vogue, which, I mean, in Teen Vogue, being indoctrinated into how to be strangled safely during sex, how to have anal sex that doesn't hurt too much. I mean, this is Teen Vogue. So we've got an over sexualized culture in which girls are wishing to escape from and causing all kinds of harm to themselves in the process. We're having boys becoming dehumanized, um, and nobody's there to catch the damage. Nobody's there to repair the damage. Well, I mean, there are some, but not enough.
And where does that leave you in your assessment of the recent High Court ruling then, Julie, with around transgender issues? I mean, it's I don't think the dust has settled on that by any means, but how do you see this evolving and playing out in society?
The gender ideology that has captured so many institutions, including police service, Crown Prosecution Service, the NHS, big corporations, big charities, swathes of the upper middle class liberal population came about um, in a context of growing misogyny and lack of regard for the safety and rights of girls and women. It didn't just pop up out of nowhere. All of a sudden, you've got men being listened to by those in power or those with influence who claim that they, as trans women, quote unquote, are oppressed by women like me. When, it was obvious it was just part of the men's rights, the anti-feminist, misogynistic men's rights movement. It was different from the usual misogynistic men's rights lot in the past, because this time the liberals were captured. The liberals were on their side and were against those of us that spoke out and said, no, we need to keep our sex-based rights, our sex-based facilities and legislation. So all the Supreme Court did was settle a fact, a point of law, which is that no, trans women are not legally women. Trans identified men have protection in their gender identity if they live as the opposite sex. It does not, to all intents and purposes, mean that they are legally women. And we argued this in the Supreme Court, and the project I set up with Kathleen Stock, the Lesbian Project, um, was an intervener among other groups in this case, where we said if a man, just because he has a gender recognition certificate and therefore is protected under the Equality Act in terms of his gender identity, if he can now say he's legally a woman, he can say he's legally entitled to enter a lesbian only space, which we had to fight for decades for. And I think that was one of the key things that convinced the court that this was not, that this did need the clarification. All the Supreme Court judges did was clarify what the law had said. And the reason why it had to do that, the reason why the most eminent, judges, the most eminent legal brains in the land had to make a ruling, well, had to clarify this, was because the likes of Stonewall, who used to be a gay rights organization and is now a trans rights activist organization, has been advising everyone, not of the law of the land, but of Stonewall law, which is they want trans women to be legally women in all aspects of life. And therefore, they've been telling institutions through their training program, I think it's the diversity, um, their workplace scheme, where they tell employers issues regarding equality and diversity on LGBTQ matters. In other words, trans women are women. You do not have to have single sex bathrooms and changing facilities and the like. Stonewall law has been operating across these institutions, and now the Supreme Court has said, no, this is the law. And so Stonewall will have to roll back, and the organisations that have been flouting the law of the land will have to also adhere to it.
Do you think Stonewall has run its course, Julie? I mean, Peter Tatchell's been on the Godcast, and some associates of mine have said, Stonewall have got a lot to answer for. They pushed so hard initially on gay rights, and those gay rights were won effectively, and this is because they've got nothing else to chase after, and this, in many ways, they're responsible for being where we are today.
Yeah, they are. They are. And they have made a decision back in 2015 when Ruth Hunt took over from Ben Summerskill and became chief exec. She knew what to chase. She chased the money and she chased the new kid on the block, the trans activist that was going to give her lots of kudos and lots of praise and keep Stonewall relevant. It absolutely should have folded. It got equal marriage over the line, other pieces of legislation. It was actually about time that it started to prioritise issues relating to lesbians as opposed to gay men, who always get more attention when it comes to research and public scrutiny as to their needs, you know, and countering discrimination in this way. But it didn't. It in fact it did then focus on the lesbians with a penis, as they would refer to them. I would very like to see the back of it. I am always sorry to see people lose their jobs, unless, of course, they're the ones in the engine room pushing forward this dangerous ideology that has ruined lives. But I want it to fold, and it looks like it will very soon. It's losing money hand over fist. Its protection racket that I mentioned earlier, where it has dictated to employers as to what they should have in place as so-called trans rights, is pretty much done and dusted. They have been exposed as the charlatans that they are. And I wish it would just go away and stop causing any more harm. I don't think it's got the power anymore to cause harm. As I say, it's been fully exposed. But lots of organisations have set up as an alternative to Stonewall, the LGB Alliance, the Lesbian Project, numbers of gay rights organisations now that refuse to prioritise gender identity over sexual orientation and same-sex attraction.
That's pretty conclusive, Julie. Thank you for for your remarks. I'm really mindful of time, but I'm so fascinated. It's such a fascinating conversation. I want to just ask a couple of other things. I'm going to ask you about your new book in a moment, but in the church, Julie, I for my sins, sit on the General Synod. I'm part of an inclusive church. I work with gay colleagues, clergy, and we are been campaigning and fighting for same-sex relationships to be nothing more than blessed at this stage, and the church continues to resist and really get under my skin. Actually, how do you assess the church in this kind of behaviour?
Well, it's obviously a big question, but I remember when I was researching my book that came out in 2014, so more than a decade ago, which was about lesbian and gay life in the UK. And I spoke to some faith-based um, organisations, and I spoke to some Catholic nuns who have always been around the scene a little bit in the work that I do, because I've done lots of anti-trafficking work, looking at sexual exploitation of women. For example, in the King's Cross area, there's an organisation called Women at the Well that most people don't know. It's funded by the Catholic Church, but they have it. There's no requirement for any of the women that they support to have a faith or adhere to any of the church doctrine, which is how it should be, in my view. And I asked about uh, equal marriage and the like, and this one particular nun who's got a great name, she's Sister Linda Dearlove. She's fabulous. She said, look, most Catholics I know would support their lesbian daughters or gay sons if they were told that, this is how things were. Marriage is a separate issue because of the meaning behind marriage for the church. And we'll get there basically. Now, what matters to me is that if people have a faith, if lesbians and gay men wish to go to church, synagogue, whatever place of worship, that they should be welcomed and included. And that is, I think, the bottom line. I know how the church has resisted certain issues to do with what I would say equality between women and men. And this is one of those issues where there's still work to be done. But I applaud those within the church in doing this work. And I do know, there are friends and colleagues of mine who do believe in God and who do regularly attend whichever religious whichever place of worship suits them. And good for them. I used to be a rather staunch secularist, and now I would probably say that I'm more of an atheist. And the problem that I have isn't with religion. Obviously, we're not speaking about fundamentalist religion, which is wholly dangerous. The problem I have is not believing in God. Now, that sounds very, very odd, but because I don't believe in a God, I find it difficult to connect to any particular church or religion. And I think there are people that are very senior in the church who also don't know whether there is a God, but who see religion and the role that they play as something not reliant on that. And I think this is something that a lot of people find quite surprising.
That's quite interesting. I've recently been, we've we've got lots of time, but I do believe in God. But I believe more in the message of Jesus Christ than I do in the institution that I'm part of. And I think there might be quite a lot of clerics or theologians that would say similar.
Mm.
It's and that is the dichotomy. That's the struggle because the institution frustrates me a lot of the time,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating conversation, and what you said about the fundamentalists, they're the real concern for me, is that,
Oh,
and you talked about that earlier.
horrendous. Horrendous. And I really don't understand why we seem to have a get out of jail free clause
Mm.
for Islamic fundamentalists that we don't and shouldn't have for some of the Christian or Jewish fundamentalists. We rightly critique those institutions, and we do take a different view to the Islamic fundamentalists. We absolutely do.
Mm.
And it's cowardice, obviously. And for some, it's cultural relativism. They think that that translates into Muslim, that translates into brown or black skinned Muslim, that translates to racism. They use the term Islamophobia, which is a word I don't accept. And then it becomes a total mess. But I do think fundamentalism is the scourge of the modern day, of the world today.
Yeah.
And I do understand people taking comfort in either revitalizing a faith that they had, perhaps that had lapsed. I do know lapsed Catholics who have now started going to church again, or just being curious about the institutions. And I'm definitely more curious than I used to be, and definitely less hardline about it all.
I could talk I could talk to you all day, Julia. I find you absolutely really honest and fascinating in your responses. But we're gonna have to go in a minute. But let's plug the old book. You've got this new book out, um, Lesbians. Where are we? Where are you? Tell people what might be attractive about this book.
Well, it's Lesbians, Where Are We Now? And it came out last month in April 2025. And it's effectively looking at the way that the lesbian community, groupings, politics, spaces have been under attack, mainly from gender activists, but from any of the men's rights movement, from the postmodernist queer movements coming out of universities, in other words, those that espouse luxury beliefs, as I would call them, that lesbians has, the lesbian rights movement, of which I've been part of since the late 1970s. There's always been a grassroots movement to demand equality and an end to prejudice and bigotry for those same-sex attracted women, and more of an understanding and more of a consensus that we exist, that we are certainly don't believe the stereotypes. And looking at a way forward, which I think has to be a part of the wider feminist movement, to say, while women are oppressed, while women are discriminated against, lesbians are, and in many ways more so than other women, but we should all stick together to fight the good fight.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go and order a copy now for my colleague, who's a sort of lady in her thirties, and um, I always think about in my context, Julie, I think about the church people I feel I'm not going to create a setting in the Church of England where gay people can get married, but hopefully I've made a small contribution,
Mhm.
to that maybe in 10, 15 years. And,
Yes,
and I think you fall into that category for being a great contributor. And I'm sure people hold you in the highest of esteem and appreciate what you've done.
some do, some don't. But I'd just like to also say thank you to you for fighting the good fight and for inviting me to speak to you today.
It's been great. Thanks for coming on, Julie. Thank you.
My pleasure.